The Labours of Hercules, the Nemean Lion. "Anything of interest this morning, Miss Lemon?" he asked as he entered the room the following morning. He trusted Miss Lemon. She was a woman without imagination, but she had an instinct. Anything that she mentioned as worth consideration usually was worth consideration. She was a born secretary. "Nothing much, Mr. Poirot. There is just one letter that I thought might interest you. I have put it on the top of the pile." "And what is that?" He took an interested step forward. "It's from a man who wants you to investigate the disappearance of his wife's Pekingese dog." Poirot paused with his foot still in the air. He threw a glance of deep reproach at Miss Lemon. She did not notice it. She had begun to type. She typed with the speed and the precision of a quick-firing tank. Poirot was shaken and embittered. Miss Lemon, the efficient Miss Lemon, had let him down. A Pekingese dog! A Pekingese dog! And after the dream he had had last night, he had been leaving Buckingham Palace after being personally thanked when his valet had come in with his morning chocolate. Words trembled on his lips, witty, caustic words. He did not utter them because Miss Lemon, owing to the speed and the efficiency of her typing, would not have heard them. With a grunt of disgust, he picked up the topmost letter from the little pile on the side of his desk. Yes, it was exactly as Miss Lemon had said. A city address, a curt, businesslike, unrefined demand. The subject, the kidnapping of a Pekingese dog. One of those bulging-eyed, over-pampered pets of a rich woman. Hercule Poirot's lip curled as he read it. Nothing unusual about this. Nothing out of the way but yes, in one small detail. Miss Lemon was right. In one small detail there was something unusual. Hercule Poirot sat down. He read the letter slowly and carefully. It was not the kind of case he wanted. It was not the kind of case he had promised himself. It was not in any sense an important case. It was supremely unimportant. It was not, and here was the crux of his objection, it was not a proper labor of Hercules. But unfortunately, he was curious. Yes, he was curious. He raised his voice so as to be heard by Miss Lemon above the noise of her typing. "Ring up this Sir Joseph Hoggan," he ordered, "and make an appointment for me to see him at his office as he suggests." As usual, Miss Lemon had been right. Part 2. "I am a plain man, Mr. Poirot," said Sir Joseph Hoggan. Hercule Poirot made a non-committal gesture with his right hand. It expressed, if you choose to take it so, admiration for the solid worth of Sir Joseph's career and an appreciation of his modesty in so describing himself. It could also have conveyed a graceful deprecation of the statement. In any case, it gave no clue to the thought then uppermost in Hercule Poirot's mind, which was that Sir Joseph certainly was, using the term in its more colloquial sense, a very plain man indeed. Hercule Poirot's eyes rested critically on the swelling jowl, the small pig eyes, the bulbous nose, and the close-lipped mouth. The whole general effect reminded him of someone or something, but for the moment he could not recollect who or what it was. A memory stirred dimly. A long time ago, in Belgium, something surely to do with soap? Sir Joseph was continuing. No frills about me. I don't beat about the bush. Most people, Mr. Poirot, would let this business go, write it off as a bad debt, and forget about it. But that's not Joseph Hoggin's way. I am a rich man, and in a manner of speaking, £200 is neither here nor there to me. Poirot interpolated swiftly. I congratulate you. Eh? Sir Joseph paused a minute. His small eyes narrowed themselves still more. He said sharply, That's not to say that I'm in the habit of throwing my money about. What I want, I pay for, but I pay the market price, no more. Hercule Poirot said, You realize that my fees are high? Yes, but this, Sir Joseph looked at him cunningly, is a very small matter. Hercule Poirot shrugged his shoulders. He said, I do not bargain. I am an expert. For the services of an expert, you have to pay. Sir Joseph said frankly, I know you're a tip-top man at this sort of thing. I made inquiries, and I was told that you were the best man available. I mean to get to the bottom of this business, and I don't grudge the expense. That's why I got you to come here. You are fortunate, said Hercule Poirot. Sir Joseph said, again. Exceedingly fortunate, said Hercule Poirot firmly. I am, I may say so without undue modesty, at the apex of my career. Very shortly I intend to retire, and to live in the country, to travel occasionally to see the world. Also, it may be to cultivate my garden with particular attention to improving the strain of vegetable marrows. Magnificent vegetables, but they lack flavor. That, however, is not the point. I wished merely to explain that before retiring, I had imposed upon myself a certain task. I have decided to accept 12 cases, no more, no less, a self-imposed labors of Hercules, if I may so describe it. Your case, Sir Joseph, is the first of the 12. I was attracted to it. he sighed, by its striking unimportance. Importance? Said Sir Joseph. Unimportance was what I said. I have been called in for varying causes, to investigate murders, unexplained deaths, robberies, thefts of jewelry. This is the first time that I have been asked to turn my talents to elucidate the kidnapping of a Pekingese dog. Sir Joseph grunted. He said, "You surprise me. I should have said you'd have had no end of women pestering you about their pet dogs. That certainly. But it is the first time that I am summoned by the husband in the case." Sir Joseph's little eyes narrowed appreciatively. He said, "I begin to see why they recommended you to me. You're a shrewd fellow, Mr. Poirot." Poirot murmured, "If you will, now tell me the facts of the case. The dog disappeared. When?" "Exactly a week ago. And your wife is by now quite frantic, I presume." Sir Joseph stared. He said, "You don't understand. The dog has been returned." "Returned? Then permit me to ask, where do I enter the matter?" Sir Joseph went crimson in the face. "Because I'm damned if I'll be swindled. Now then, Mr. Poirot, I'm going to tell you the whole thing. The dog was stolen a week ago, nipped in Kensington Gardens, where he was out with my wife's companion. The next day, my wife got a demand for £200. I ask you, £200 for a damned yapping little brute that's always getting under your feet anyway." Poirot murmured, "You did not approve of paying such a sum, naturally." "Of course I didn't, or would have, if I'd known anything about it. Milly, my wife, knew that well enough. She didn't say anything to me, just sent off the money in £1 notes as stipulated to the address given." "And the dog was returned?" "Yes. That evening the bell rang, and the little brute sitting on the doorstep, and not a soul to be seen." "Perfectly. Continue." "Then, of course, Milly confessed what she's done, and I lost my temper a bit. However, I calmed down after a while. After all, the thing was done, and you can't expect a woman to behave with any sense. And I dare say I should have let the whole thing go if it hadn't been for meeting old Samuelson at the club." "Yes?" "Damn it all, this thing must be a positive racket. Exactly the same thing had happened to him. £300 they'd rooked his wife of. Well, that was a bit too much. I decided the thing had got to be stopped. I sent for you." "But surely, Sir Joseph, the proper thing, and a very much more inexpensive thing, would have been to send for the police." Sir Joseph rubbed his nose. He said, "Are you married, Mr. Poirot?" "Alas," said Poirot, "I have not that felicity." Said Sir Joseph. "Don't know about felicity, but if you were, you'd know that women are funny creatures. My wife went into hysterics at the mere mention of the police. She'd got it into her head that something would happen to her precious Shantung if I went to them. She wouldn't hear of the idea, and I may say she doesn't take very kindly to the idea of you being called in. But I stood firm there, and at last she gave way. But, mind you, she doesn't like it. Hercule Poirot murmured, "The position is, I perceive, a delicate one. It would be as well, perhaps, if I were to interview Madame, your wife, and gain further particulars from her, whilst at the same time reassuring her as to the future safety of her dog." Sir Joseph nodded and rose to his feet. He said, "I'll take you along in the car right away." Part 3. In a large, hot, ornately furnished drawing room, two women were sitting. As Sir Joseph and Hercule Poirot entered, a small Pekingese dog rushed forward, barking furiously and circling dangerously round Poirot's ankles. "Shan, Shan, come here to mother. Lovey, pick him up, Miss Carnaby." The second woman hurried forward, and Hercule Poirot murmured, "A veritable lion indeed." Rather breathlessly, Shanktung's captor agreed. "Yes, indeed, he's such a good watchdog. He's not frightened of anything or anyone. He's a lovely boy, then." Having performed the necessary introduction, Sir Joseph said, "Well, Mr. Poirot, I leave you to get on with it." And with a short nod, he left the room. Lady Hoggin was a stout, petulant-looking woman with dyed henna red hair. Her companion, the fluttering Miss Carnaby, was a plump, amiable-looking creature between 40 and 50. She treated Lady Hoggin with great deference, and was clearly frightened to death of her. Poirot said, "Now tell me, Lady Hoggin, the full circumstances of this abominable crime." Lady Hoggin flushed. "I'm very glad to hear you say that, Mr. Poirot, for it was a crime. Pekingese are terribly sensitive, just as sensitive as children. Poor Shantung might have died of fright, if of nothing else." Miss Carnaby chimed in breathlessly. "Yes, it was wicked, wicked." "Please tell me the facts." "Well, it was like this. Shantung was out for a walk in the park with Miss Carnaby." "Oh dear me, yes, it was all my fault," chimed in the companion. "How could I have been so stupid, so careless?" Lady Hoggins said acidly, "I don't want to reproach you, Miss Carnaby, but I do think you might have been more alert." Poirot transferred his gaze to the companion. "What happened?" Miss Carnaby burst into voluble and slightly flustered speech. "Well, it was the most extraordinary thing. We had just been along for the flower walk. Shantung was on the lead, of course. He'd had his little run on the grass, and I was just about to turn and go home when my attention was caught by a baby in a pram, such a lovely baby. It smiled at me, lovely rosy cheeks and such curls. I couldn't just resist speaking to the nurse in charge and asking how old it was. 17 months, she said. And I'm sure I was only speaking to her for about a minute or two, and then suddenly I looked down and Shan wasn't there anymore. The lead had been cut right through." Lady Hoggins said, If you'd been paying proper attention to your duties, nobody could have sneaked up and cut that lead." Miss Carnaby seemed inclined to burst into tears. Poirot said hastily, "And what happened next?" "Well, of course, I looked everywhere and called, and I asked the park attendant if he'd seen a man carrying a Pekingese dog, but he hadn't noticed anything of the kind. And I didn't know what to do, and I went on searching, but at last, of course, I had to come home." Miss Carnaby stopped dead. Poirot could imagine the scene that followed well enough. He asked, "And then you received a letter?" Lady Hoggin took up the tale. "By the first post the following morning. It said that if I wanted to see Shantung alive, I was to send £200 in £1 notes in an unregistered packet to Captain Curtis, 38 Bloomsbury Road Square. It said that if the money were marked or the police informed, then Shantung's ears and tail would be cut off." Miss Carnaby began to sniff. "So awful," she murmured. "How people can be such fiends." Lady Hoggin went on. "It said that if I sent the money at once, Shantung would be returned the same evening alive and well, but that if afterwards I went to the police, it would be Shantung who'd suffer for it." Miss Carnaby murmured tearfully, "Oh dear, I'm so afraid that even now, of course, Mr. Poirot isn't exactly the police." Lady Hoggin said anxiously, "So you see, Mr. Poirot, you will have to be very careful." Hercule Poirot was quick to allay her anxiety. "But I'm not of the police. My inquiries, they will be conducted very discreetly, very quietly. You can be assured, Lady Hoggin, that Shantung will be perfectly safe. That I will guarantee." Both ladies seemed relieved by the magic word. Poirot went on. "You have here the letter?" Lady Hoggin shook her head. "No, I was instructed to enclose it with the money." "And you did so?" "Yes." That's a pity." Miss Carnaby said brightly, "But I have the dog lead still. Shall I get it?" She left the room. Hercule Poirot profited by her absence to ask a few pertinent questions. "Amy Carnaby? Oh, she's quite all right. A good soul, though foolish, of course. I have had several companions, and they have all been complete fools. But Amy was devoted to Shantung, and she was terribly upset over the whole thing, as well she might be, hanging over perambulators and neglecting my little sweetheart. These old maids are all the same, idiotic over-babies. No, I am quite sure she had nothing whatever to do with it." "It does not seem likely," Poirot agreed. "But as the dog disappeared when in her charge, one must make quite certain of her honesty." "She has been with you long?" "Nearly a year. I had excellent references with her. She was with old Lady Hartingfield until she died. 10 years, I believe. After that, she looked after an invalid sister for a while. She is really an excellent creature, but a complete fool, as I said." Amy Carnaby returned at this minute, slightly more out of breath, and produced the cut dog lead, which she handed to Poirot with the utmost solemnity, looking at him with hopeful expectancy. Poirot surveyed it carefully. "Mais oui," he said, "this has undoubtedly been cut." The two women still waited expectantly. He said, "I will keep this." Solemnly, he put it in his pocket. The two women breathed a sigh of relief. He had clearly done what was expected of him. Part 4. It was the habit of Hercule Poirot to leave nothing untested. Though on the face of it, it seemed unlikely that Miss Carnaby was anything but the foolish and rather muddle-headed woman that she appeared to be, Poirot, nevertheless, managed to interview a somewhat forbidding lady who was the niece of the late Lady Hartingfield. "Amy Carnaby?" said Miss Maltravers. "Of course, remember her perfectly. She was a good soul and suited Aunt Julia down to the ground. Devoted to dogs and excellent at reading aloud. Tactful, too. Never contradicted an invalid. What's happened to her? Not in distress of any kind, I hope? I gave her a reference about a year ago to some woman, name began with H. Poirot explained hastily that Miss Carnaby was still in her post. There had been, he said, a little trouble over a lost dog. Amy Carnaby is devoted to dogs. My aunt had a Pekingese. She left it to Miss Carnaby when she died, and Miss Carnaby was devoted to it. I believe she was quite heartbroken when it died. Oh yes, she was a good soul. Not, of course, precisely intellectual. Poirot agreed that Miss Carnaby could not, perhaps, be described as an intellectual. His next proceeding was to discover the park keeper to whom Miss Carnaby had spoken on the fateful afternoon. This he did without much difficulty. The man remembered the incident in question. Middle-aged lady, rather stout, in a regular state she was, lost her Pekingese dog. I knew her well by sight. Brings the dog along most afternoons. I saw her come in with it. She was in a rare taking when she lost it. Came running to me to know if I'd seen anyone with a Pekingese dog. Well, I ask you, I can tell you the Gardens is full of dogs, every kind. Terriers, Pecks, German sausage dogs, even them Borzois, all kinds we have. Not likely as I'd notice one Peck more than another. Hercule Poirot nodded his head thoughtfully. He went to 38 Bloomsbury Road Square. Numbers 38, 39, and 40 were incorporated together as the Balaclava Private Hotel. Poirot walked up to the steps and pushed open the door. He was greeted inside by gloom and a smell of cooking cabbage with a reminiscence of breakfast kippers. On his left was a mahogany table with a sad-looking chrysanthemum plant on it. Above the table was a big baize-covered rack into which letters were stuck. Poirot stared at the board thoughtfully for some minutes. He pushed open a door on his right. It led into a kind of lounge with small tables and some so-called easy chairs covered with a depressing pattern of cretonne. 3 old ladies and one fierce-looking old gentleman raised their heads and gazed at the intruder with deadly venom. Hercule Poirot blushed and withdrew. He walked farther along the passage and came to a staircase. On his right, a passage branched at right angles to what was evidently the dining room. A little way along this passage was a door marked "Office." On this Poirot tapped. Receiving no response, he opened the door and looked in. There was a large desk in the room, covered with papers, but there was no one to be seen. He withdrew, closing the door again. He penetrated to the dining room. A sad-looking girl in a dirty apron was shuffling about with a basket of knives and forks with which she was laying the tables. Hercule Poirot said apologetically, "Excuse me, but could I see the manageress?" The girl looked at him with lackluster eyes. She said, "I don't know, I'm sure." Hercule Poirot said, "There is no one in the office." "Well, I don't know where she'd be, I'm sure." "Perhaps," Hercule Poirot said, patient and persistent, "you could find out?" The girl sighed. Dreary as her day's round was, it had now been made additionally so by this new burden laid upon her. She said sadly, "Well, I'll see what I can do." Poirot thanked her and removed himself once more to the hall, not daring to face the malevolent glare of the occupants of the lounge. He was staring up at the baize-covered letter rack when a rustle and a strong smell of Devonshire violets proclaimed the arrival of the manageress. Mrs. Hart was full of graciousness. She exclaimed, "So sorry I was not in my office. You were requiring rooms?" Hercule Poirot murmured, "Not precisely. I was wondering if a friend of mine had been staying here lately, a Captain Curtis." "Curtis," explained Mrs. Hart. "Captain Curtis. Now where have I heard that name?" Poirot did not help her. She shook her head vexedly. He said, "You have not, then, had a Captain Curtis staying here?" "Well, not lately, certainly. And yet, the name is certainly familiar to me. Can you describe your friend at all?" "That," said Hercule Poirot, "would be difficult." He went on, "I suppose it sometimes happens that letters arrive for people when in actual fact no one of that name is staying here." "That does happen, of course. What do you do with such letters?" "Well, we keep them for a time. You see, it probably means that the person in question will arrive shortly. Of course, if letters or parcels are a long time here unclaimed, they are returned to the post office." Hercule Poirot nodded thoughtfully. He said, "I comprehend." He added, "It's like this, you see. I wrote a letter to my friend here." Mrs. Hart's face cleared. "That explains it. I must have noticed the name on an envelope. But really, we have so many ex-army gentlemen staying here, or passing through. Let me see now." She peered up at the board. Hercule Poirot said, "It is not there now. It must have been returned to the postman, I suppose. I'm sorry. Nothing important, I hope?" No, it was of no importance." As he moved towards the door, Mrs. Hart, enveloped in her pungent odour of violence, pursued him. "If your friend should come?" "It is most unlikely. I must have made a mistake." "Our terms," said Mrs. Hart, "are very moderate. Coffee after dinner is included. I would like you to see one or two of our bed-sitting rooms." With difficulty, Hercule Poirot escaped. Part 5. The drawing-room of Mrs. Samuelson was larger, more lavishly furnished, and enjoyed an even more stifling amount of central heating than that of Lady Hoggin. Hercule Poirot picked his way giddily amongst the gilded console tables and large groups of statuary. Mrs. Samuelson was taller than Lady Hoggin, and her hair was dyed with peroxide. Her Pekingese was called Nanki Poo. His bulging eyes surveyed Hercule Poirot with arrogance. Miss Kebble, Mrs. Samuelson's companion, was thin and scraggy, where Miss Carnaby had been plump, but she was also voluble and slightly breathless. She, too, had been blamed for Nanki Poo's disappearance. But really, Mr. Poirot, it was the most amazing thing. It all happened in a second. Outside Harrods it was. A nurse there asked me the time. Poirot interrupted her. A nurse? A hospital nurse? No, a children's nurse. Such a sweet baby it was. Such a sweet baby it was, too. A dear little mite. Such lovely rosy cheeks. They say children don't look healthy in London, but I'm sure— Ellen, said Mrs. Samuelson. Miss Kebble blushed, stammered, and subsided into silence. Mrs. Samuelson said acidly, and while Miss Kebble was bending over a perambulator that had nothing to do with her, this audacious villain cut Nanki Poo's lead and made off with him. Miss Kebble murmured tearfully, "It all happened in a second. I looked round, and the darling boy was gone. There was just the dangling lead in my hand. Perhaps you'd like to see the lead, Mr. Poirot?" "By no means," said Poirot hastily. He had no wish to make a collection of cut dog leads. "I understand," he went on, "that shortly afterwards you received a letter." The story followed the same course exactly. The letter, the threats of violence to Nanki Poor's ears and tail. Only two things were different. The sum of money demanded, £300, and the address to which it was to be sent. This time it was to be Commander Blackley, Harrington Hotel, 76 Clonmel Gardens, Kensington. Mrs. Samuelson went on. "When Nanki Poo was safely back again, I went to the place myself, Mr. Poirot. After all, £300 is £300. Certainly it is. The very first thing I saw was my letter enclosing money in a kind of rack in the hall. Whilst I was waiting for the proprietress, I slipped it into my bag. Unfortunately," Poirot said, "unfortunately, when you opened it, it contained only blank sheets of paper." "How did you know?" Mrs. Samuelson turned on him with awe. Poirot shrugged his shoulders. "Obviously, chère madame, the thief would take care to recover the money before he returned the dog. He would then replace the notes with blank paper and return the letter to the rack in case its absence should be noticed. No such person as Commander Blackley had ever stayed there. Poirot smiled. And of course, my husband was extremely annoyed about the whole thing. In fact, he was livid, absolutely livid. Poirot murmured cautiously, "You did not consult him before dispatching the money?" "Certainly not," said Mrs. Samuelson with decision. Poirot looked a question. The lady explained. "I wouldn't have risked it for a moment. Men are so extraordinary when it's a question of money. Jacob would have insisted on going to the police." "I couldn't risk that. My poor darling Nanki Poo. Anything might have happened to him. Of course, I had to tell my husband afterwards, because I had to explain why I was overdrawn at the bank." Poirot murmured, "Quite so, quite so." "And I have really never seen him so angry. Men," said Mrs. Samuelson, rearranging her handsome diamond bracelet and turning her rings on her fingers, "think of nothing but money." Part 6. Hercule Poirot went up in the lift to Sir Joseph Hoggin's office. He sent in his card and was told that Sir Joseph was engaged at the moment, but would see him presently. A haughty blonde sailed out of Sir Joseph's room at last, with her hands full of papers. She gave the quaint little man a disdainful glance in passing. Sir Joseph was seated behind his immense mahogany desk. There was a trace of lipstick on his chin. "Well, Mr. Poirot, sit down. Got any news for me?" Hercule Poirot said, "The whole affair is of a pleasing simplicity. In each case, the money was sent to one of those boarding houses or private hotels where there is no porter or hall attendant, and where a large number of guests are always coming and going, including a fairly large preponderance of ex-servicemen. Nothing would be easier than for anyone to walk in, abstract a letter from the rack, either take it away or else remove the money and replace it with blank paper. Therefore, in every case, the trail ends abruptly in a blank wall." "You mean you've no idea who the fellow is?" "I have certain ideas, yes. It will take a few days to follow them up." Sir Joseph looked at him curiously. "Good work. Then, when you have got anything to report, I will report to you at your house." Sir Joseph said, "If you get to the bottom of this business, it will be a pretty good piece of work." Hercule Poirot said, "There is no question of failure. Hercule Poirot does not fail." Sir Joseph Hoggin looked at the little man and grinned. "Sure of yourself, aren't you?" he demanded. "Entirely with reason." "Oh well," Sir Joseph Hoggin leaned back in his chair. "Pride goes before a fall, you know." Part 7. Hercule Poirot, sitting in front of his electric radiator and feeling a quiet satisfaction in its neat geometrical pattern, was giving instructions to his valet and general factotum. "You understand, Georges?" "Perfectly, sir." "More probably a flat or a maisonette. And it will definitely be within certain limits. South of the Park, east of Kensington Church, west of Knightsbridge Barracks, and north of Fulham Road." "I understand perfectly, sir." Poirot murmured. A curious little case. There is evidence here of a very definite talent for organization. And there is, of course, the surprising invisibility of the star performer, the Nemean lion himself, if I may so style him. Yes, an interesting little case. I could wish that I felt more attracted to my client, but he bears an unfortunate resemblance to a soap manufacturer of Liège, who poisoned his wife in order to marry a blonde secretary, one of my early successes. George shook his head. He said gravely, "These blondes, sir, they're responsible for a lot of trouble." Part 8. It was 3 days later when the invaluable George said, "This is the address, sir." Hercule Poirot took the piece of paper handed to him. "Excellent, my good George. And what day of the week?" "Thursdays, sir." "Thursdays. And today, most fortunately, is a Thursday. So there need be no delay." 20 minutes later, Hercule Poirot was climbing the stairs of an obscure block of flats tucked away in a little street leading off a more fashionable one. Number 10 Rosholm Mansions was on the third and top floor, and there was no lift. Poirot toiled upwards round and round the narrow corkscrew staircase. He paused to regain his breath on the top landing, and from behind the door of number 10, a new sound broke the silence: the sharp bark of a dog. Hercule Poirot nodded his head with a slight smile. He pressed the bell of number 10. The barking redoubled. Footsteps came to the door. It was opened. Miss Amy Carnaby fell back. Her hand went to her ample breast. "You permit that I enter?" said Hercule Poirot, and entered without waiting for the reply. There was a sitting-room door opened on the right, and he walked in. Behind him, Miss Carnaby followed as though in a dream. The room was very small and much overcrowded. Amongst the furniture a human being could be discovered. An elderly woman lying on a sofa, drawn up to the gas fire. As Poirot came in, a Pekingese dog jumped off the sofa and came forward, uttering a few sharp, suspicious barks. "Aha," said Poirot, "the chief actor. I salute you, my little friend." He bent forward, extending his hand. The dog sniffed at it, his intelligent eyes fixed on the man's face. Miss Carnaby murmured faintly, "So you know." Hercule Poirot nodded. "Yes, I know." He looked at the woman on the sofa. "Your sister, I think?" Miss Carnaby said mechanically, "Yes, Emily. This is Mr. Poirot." Emily Carnaby gave a gasp. She said, "Oh!" Amy Carnaby said, "Augustus." The Pekingese looked towards her. His tail moved. Then he resumed his scrutiny of Poirot's hand. Again, his tail moved faintly. Gently, Poirot picked the little dog up and sat down with Augustus on his knee. He said, "So I have captured the Nemean lion. My task is completed." Amy Carnaby said in a hard, dry voice. Do you really know everything? Poirot nodded. I think so. You organized this business with Augustus to help you. You took your employee's dog out for the usual walk, brought him here, and went on to the park with Augustus. The park keeper saw you with a Pekingese as usual. The nurse girl, if we ever found her, would also have agreed that you had a Pekingese with you when you spoke to her. Then, while you were talking, you cut the lead, and Augustus, trained by you, slipped off at once and made a beeline back home. A few minutes later, you gave the alarm that the dog had been stolen. There was a pause. Then Miss Carnaby drew herself with a certain pathetic dignity. She said, Yes, it's all quite true. I have nothing to say. The invalid woman on the sofa began to cry softly. Poirot said, Nothing at all, mademoiselle? Miss Carnaby said, Nothing. I have been a thief, and now I am found out. Poirot murmured, You have nothing to say in your own defence? A spot of red showed suddenly in Amy Carnaby's white cheeks. She said, I don't regret what I did. I think that you are a kind man, Mr. Poirot, and that possibly you might understand. You see, I've been so terribly afraid. Afraid? Yes, it's difficult for a man to understand, I expect. But you see, I'm not a clever woman at all, and I've no training, and I'm getting older, and I'm so terrified for the future. I've not been able to save anything. How could I, with Emily to be cared for? And as I get older and more incompetent, there won't be anyone who wants me. They'll want somebody young and brisk. I've known so many people like I am. Nobody wants you, and you live in one room, and you can't have a fire or any warmth, and not very much to eat, and at last you can't even pay the rent of your room. There are institutions, of course, but it's not very easy to get into them unless you have influential friends, and I haven't. There are a good many others situated like I am, poor companions, untrained, useless women, with nothing to look forward to but a deadly fear. Her voice shook. She said, And so some of us got together and I thought of this. It was really having Augustus that put it into my mind. You see, to most people, one Pekingese is very much like another, just as we think the Chinese are. Really, of course, it's ridiculous. No one who knew could mistake Augustus for Nanki Poo or Shangtung or any of the other Pecks. He's far more intelligent, for one thing, and he's much handsomer. But, as I say, to most people, a peck is just a peck. Augustus put it into my head that, combined with the fact that so many rich women have Pekingese dogs. Poirot said with a faint smile, It must have been a profitable racket. How many are there in the gang? Or perhaps I had better ask how often operations have been successfully carried out. Miss Carnaby said simply, Shantung was the 16th. Hercule Poirot raised his eyebrows. I congratulate you. Your organization must have been indeed excellent. Emily Carnaby said, Amy was always good at organization. Our father, he was the Vicar of Kellington in Essex, always said that Amy had quite a genius for planning. She always made all the arrangements for the socials and the bazaars and all that. Poirot said with a little bow, I agree. As a criminal, mademoiselle, you are quite the first rank. Amy Carnaby cried, A criminal. Oh dear, I suppose I am. But I never felt like that. How did it feel? Of course, you are quite right. It was breaking the law, but you see, how can I explain it? Nearly all these women who employ us are so very rude and unpleasant. Lady Hoggin, for instance, doesn't mind what she says to me. She said her tonic tasted unpleasant the other day and practically accused me of tampering with it. All that sort of thing. Miss Carnaby flushed. It's really very unpleasant. And not being able to say anything or answer back makes it rankle more, if you know what I mean. I know what you mean, said Hercule Poirot. And then seeing money frittered away so wastefully, that is upsetting. And Sir Joseph, occasionally he used to describe a coup he made in the city, sometimes something that seemed to me, of course, I know I've only got a woman's brain and don't understand finance, downright dishonest. Well, you know, Mr. Poirot, it all unsettled me, and I felt that to take a little money away from these people who really wouldn't miss it and hadn't been too scrupulous in acquiring it, well, really, it hardly seemed wrong at all. Poirot murmured, A modern Robin Hood. Tell me, Miss Carnaby, did you ever have to carry out the threats you used in your letters? Threats. Were you ever compelled to mutilate the animals in the way you specified? Miss Carnaby regarded him in horror. Of course, I would never have dreamed of doing such a thing. That was just an artistic touch. Very artistic. It worked. Well, of course, I knew it would. I know how I should have felt about Augustus, and of course, I had to make sure these women never told their husbands until afterwards. The plan worked beautifully every time. In 9 cases out of 10, the companion was given the letter with the money to post. We usually steamed it open, took out the notes, and replaced them with paper. Once or twice the woman posted it herself. Then, of course, the companion had to go to the hotel and take the letter out of the rack. But that was quite easy, too. And the nursemaid touch? Was it always a nursemaid? Well, you see, Mr. Poirot, old maids are known to be foolishly sentimental about babies. So it seemed quite natural that they should be absorbed over a baby and not notice anything. Hercule Poirot sighed. He said, Your psychology is excellent. Your organization is first class. And you are also a very fine actress. Your performance the other day, when I interviewed Lady Hoggin, was irreproachable. Never think of yourself disparagingly, Miss Carnaby. You may be what is termed an untrained woman, but there is nothing wrong with your brains or with your courage." Miss Carnaby said with a faint smile, "And yet I have been found out, Mr. Poirot." "Only by me. That was inevitable. When I had interviewed Mrs. Samuelson, I realized that the kidnapping of Shantung was one of a series. I had already learned that you had once been left with a Pekingese dog and had an invalid sister. I had only to ask my invaluable servant to look for a small flat within a certain radius occupied by an invalid lady who had a Pekingese dog and a sister who visited her once a week on her day out. It was simple." Amy Carnaby drew herself up. She said, "You have been very kind. It emboldens me to ask you a favour." "I cannot, I know, escape the penalty for what I have done. I shall be sent to prison, I suppose. But if you could, Mr. Poirot, avert some of the publicity, so distressing for Emily and for those who knew us in the old days." "I could not, I suppose, go to prison under a false name? Or is that a very wrong thing to ask?" Hercule Poirot said. "I think I can do more than that. But first of all, I must make one thing quite clear. This ramp has got to stop. There must be no more disappearing dogs. All that is finished." "Yes, oh yes. And the money you extracted from Lady Hoggin must be returned." Amy Carnaby crossed the room, opened the drawer of the bureau, and returned with a packet of notes which she handed to Poirot. "I was going to pay it into the pool today." Poirot took the notes and counted them. He got up. "I think it possible, Miss Carnaby, that I may be able to persuade Sir Joseph not to prosecute." "Oh, Mr. Poirot!" Amy Carnaby clasped her hands. Emily gave a cry of joy. Augustus barked and wagged his tail. "As for you, mon ami," said Poirot, addressing him, "there is one thing that I wish you would give me. It is your mantle of invisibility that I need. In all these cases, nobody for a moment suspected that there was a second dog involved. Augustus possessed the lion's skin of invisibility." "Of course, Mr. Poirot, according to the legend, Pekingese were lions once, and they still have the hearts of lions. Augustus is, I suppose, the dog that was left to you by Lady Hartingfield, and who is reported to have died. Were you never afraid of him coming home alone through the traffic?" "Oh no, Mr. Poirot. Augustus is very clever about traffic. I have trained him most carefully. He has even grasped the principle of one-way streets." "In that case," said Hercule Poirot, "he is superior to most human beings." Part 9. Sir Joseph received Hercule Poirot in his study. He said, "Well, Mr. Poirot, made your boast good?" "Let me first ask you a question," said Poirot as he seated himself. "I know who the criminal is, and I think it possible that I can produce sufficient evidence to convict this person. But in that case, I doubt if you will ever recover your money." "Not getting back my money?" Sir Joseph turned purple. Hercule Poirot went on, "But I am not a policeman. I am acting in this case solely in your interests. I could, I think, recover your money intact if no proceedings were taken." "Eh?" said Sir Joseph. "That needs a bit of thinking about. It is entirely for you to decide. Strictly speaking, I suppose you ought to prosecute in the public interest. Most people would say so." "I dare say they would," said Joseph sharply. "It wouldn't be their money that had gone west. If there's one thing I hate, it's to be swindled. Nobody ever swindled me and got away with it." "Well then, what do you decide?" Sir Joseph hit the table with his fist. "I'll have the brass. Nobody's going to say they got away with £200 of my money." Hercule Poirot rose, crossed to the writing table, wrote out a cheque for £200 and handed it to the other man. Sir Joseph said in a weak voice, "Well, I'm damned. Who the devil is this fellow?" Poirot shook his head. "If you accept the money, there must be no questions asked." Sir Joseph folded up the cheque and put it in his pocket. "That's a pity, but the money's the thing. And what do I owe you, Mr. Poirot?" "My fees will not be high. This was, as I said, a very unimportant matter." He paused and added, "Nowadays, nearly all cases are murder cases." Sir Joseph started slightly. "Must be interesting," he said. "Sometimes. Curiously enough, you recall to me one of my early cases in Belgium, many years ago. The chief protagonist was very like you in appearance. He was a wealthy soap manufacturer. He poisoned his wife in order to be free to marry his secretary. Yes, the resemblance is very remarkable." A faint sound came from Sir Joseph's lips. They had gone a queer blue colour. All the ruddy hue had faded from his cheeks. His eyes, starting out of his head, stared at Poirot. He slipped down a little in his chair. Then, with a shaking hand, he fumbled in his pocket. He drew out the cheque and tore it into pieces. "That's washed out. See? Consider it as your fee." "Oh, but Sir Joseph, my fee would not have been as large as that." "That's all right. You keep it. I shall send it to a deserving charity." "Send it anywhere you damn well like." Poirot leaned forward. He said, "I think I need hardly point out, Sir Joseph, that in your position you would do well to be exceedingly careful." Sir Joseph said, his voice almost inaudible, "You needn't worry. I shall be careful, all right." Hercule Poirot left the house. As he went down the steps he said to himself, "So I was right." Part 10. Lady Hoggins said to her husband, "Funny, this tonic tastes quite different. It hasn't got that bitter taste any more. I wonder why." Sir Joseph growled, "Chemist, careless fellows. Make things up differently different times." Lady Hoggins said doubtfully, "I suppose that must be it." "Of course it is. What else could it be?" "Has the man found out anything about Shantung?" "Yes, he got me my money back, all right." "Who was it?" "He didn't say. Very close fellow, Hercule Poirot. But you needn't worry." "He's a funny little man, isn't he?" Sir Joseph gave a slight shiver and threw a sideways glance upwards as though he felt the invisible presence of Hercule Poirot behind his right shoulder. He had an idea that he would always feel it there. He said, "He's a damn clever little devil." And he thought to himself, "Greta can go hang. I'm not going to risk my neck for any damn platinum blonde." Part 11. "Oh!" Amy Carnaby gazed down incredulously at the cheque for £200. She cried, "Emily, Emily, listen to this. Dear Miss Carnaby, allow me to enclose a contribution to your very deserving fund before it is finally wound up. Yours very truly, Hercule Poirot." "Amy," said Emily Carnaby, "you've been incredibly lucky. Think where you might be now." "Wormwood Scrubs? Or is it Holloway?" murmured Amy Carnaby. "But that's all over now, isn't it, Augustus? No more walks to the park with mother or mother's friends and a little pair of scissors." A faraway wistfulness came into her eyes. She sighed. "Dear Augustus, it seems a pity. He's so clever. One can teach him anything."